So I just first like to apologize on behalf of Kira. As Dermot said, she was just held up in Brussels, and it wasn't 1, it was actually 2:30 when I was told to pack my bag. But I'm really pleased to be here. The lineup for today is excellent. So I'll try to do as best as Kira would have done, but you'll have to put up with my French accent instead of her Irish accent. The rest is entirely her presentation. So Patrick's done an overview of the new rules, and I'll focus on one particular aspect, which is how, or whether, and if so, how the new rules will improve access of SMEs to public contracts. And it's really been our view that under the current rules, there was actually already quite a lot of possibility to involve SMEs and to facilitate access for them, although these may not have been used so much. And so there was quite a lot of excitement when the new proposal came out, because they have as one of their main objectives to improve access of SMEs to public contracts. So what do the new rules propose? Well, as I said, one of the main aims was to improve access of SMEs, and so there are a number of ways in which this might be achieved. There are some very positive aspects and some perhaps not so positive aspects, or other elements which may work against access of SMEs. But let's look first at the really positive aspects. Patrick mentioned our new rules on lots. These are set out in Article 44 of the proposal. And Article 44 states that public contracts may be subdivided into lots. Those lots may be homogeneous. This is just a simple quantitative splitting of the contract, so in terms of value. Or they may be what the Commission calls heterogeneous lots. So they are just sort of thematic lots, say a contract for the design of a building, then a lot for the construction of the building, another lot for the fit out, etc. Thank you. But more significantly, there are now specific rules in the public sector directive for contracts above 500,000 euros, where the contracting authority must consider splitting the contract into lots. And if they decide not to do so, then they must explain the specific reasons why they have not decided to split the contract into lots. And this is what the Commission describes as the apply or explain rule. So there is no obligation to split into lots, but there is an obligation, if the contract is above 500,000, to consider whether splitting. And if the decision is not to split, then there is an obligation to state the reasons. And there are mentioned the specific reasons why the contract was not going to be split. So first element is interesting to note that the Commission uses the word specific, and that's understood to mean that it was to avoid contracting authorities just reusing the standard same language in all notices, but forcing them to apply their mind on a case-by-case basis and then spell out the reasons why the decision was not to split in the contract notice. It's also interesting to note that in its non-paper, Patrick mentioned earlier that the Commission published a number of documents accompanying the proposal. They call them the non-papers. There's a specific non-paper on access of SMEs to public contracts. And so in that non-paper, in relation to Article 44, the Commission says that these new provisions do not establish any judicial control over the reasons given by the authority in the contract notice. And I suppose the logic is here that if there is no obligation to divide into lots, then the extension is that there can't be any sort of judicial oversight of the decision whether to, or the decision not to split the contract into lots. I'm not entirely sure this is really right. I mean, that we could imagine arguments around whether the contracting authority has given due consideration to the issue. And equally, a decision to, or a decision not to split the contract into lots may in themselves be discriminatory, and that is a typical ground for challenge. So not entirely sure that this may not open a new line for challenge, and that clearly means that contracting authorities will have to tread quite carefully when they spell out their reasons in the contract notice for not splitting the contract into lots. Then, still on the subject of lots, the proposals also confirm that contracting authorities may choose to limit in advance the number of lots any one candidate can bid for, and they may also limit the number of lots that any one candidate can win, although there are a number of conditions for that. They're set out on the slide. The first condition is that the maximum number of lots that a particular candidate can win must be set out in the contract notice and in the tender documents. And secondly, the contracting authority must specify the objective and non-discriminatory criteria that it will apply in the event that a particular bidder wins more than one lot. And so what criteria will be applied to decide which one of those lots will be awarded to that particular bidder. In the non-paper, the Commission suggests that one of these objective and non-discriminatory criteria may be to ask the bidder themselves to indicate an order of priority for the various lots. So they would effectively be saying, well, if I win all of them, I prefer to have lot one. I'm not sure that in itself is not necessarily discriminatory. And actually, it may also facilitate collusion between the various bidders for those lots if they themselves have to express a preference for which lot to be awarded, obviously in the event that they are successful. But anyway, clearly these provisions, so the two aspects on lots, the mandatory consideration of the splitting into lots and then the sharing of lots are clearly helpful for SMEs, and they'll also help the contracting authority preserve plurality of suppliers and reduce over-reliance on certain suppliers. However, the proposals do not go as far as saying that contracting authorities could limit participation in the competition for the award of certain lots to SMEs. But I guess if the lots are small enough or specialized enough, that in itself may be a sufficient incentive to increase SMEs and may in fact in a way favor participation of SMEs if these lots are either small in scale or highly specialized. One of the reasons that contracting authorities often cite as a deterrent for the splitting of contract into lots is that it's more work for them than to manage. They have, instead of having only one contract to manage, they have any number of contracts to manage at the same time. And so the proposals include a specific provision here that says that the contracting authority can award a coordination lot to a particular contractor, and so the job of that particular contractor would be to coordinate all the other contractors actually performing the work under the contract. So again, that's not new, but at least it has the merit of now being spelled out in the proposals, and it may then encourage the use of this route. So far it's all good, but that's not the end of the story. Article 44, so still on lots, states that notwithstanding the requirement to consider splitting into lots and the possibility of restricting the number of lots that a particular bidder can win, at the same time the contracting authority can provide that they will either award one contract per lot or that they could award one contract covering more or all of the lots. And so again, if the contracting authority wants to use this possibility, they must reserve the right to do so in the contract notice and in the tender documents. But if that is used by the contracting authority, so if the contracting authority does decide in the end to group lots and award a much bigger contract covering all these lots, that clearly is not going to be very helpful for SMEs. And that can also raise a number of other practical problems. You could imagine, I mean, quite easily imagine that the same tenderer that would be awarded a combination of lots may not have come first on in the competitions for all these individual lots. So in the non-paper on SMEs, the Commission includes an example. It says, well, for example, if for lot A or lot 1, tenderer A is the winning bidder, and they bid 200,000 for that lot. The winning bid for lot 2 is tenderer B. The value of that winning contract is 150,000. Then we have lot 3, also won by tenderer B, for 250,000. That makes a total value for the 3 lots of 600,000. Then if tenderer A, which only won one of the 3 lots, bids a combined offer for the 3 lots at 550, then that can be awarded to, the combination of all 3 lots can be awarded to tenderer A. So again, I don't think this is something completely new. That's probably something that can be done today. But clearly that possibility being spelled out in the directive will not be helpful in increasing SMEs' access. On the other hand, it must be there to show that this mandatory consideration of splitting into lots is not there to force contracting authorities to spend more than they would otherwise be able to if they awarded bigger contracts. The other big area of sort of improvement in terms of SME access relates to the shortlisting of candidates, and this is mainly in Article 56 of the proposal on selection criteria. At the moment, when setting the conditions for participation in procurement, it is stipulated that any requirement must be related and strictly proportionate to the subject matter of the contract. And that is reinforced in the proposed directive, and it's probably taken it even a bit further because the text now also adds a requirement that any such selection criteria must be appropriate. And so here the Commission is really trying to encourage contracting authorities to give serious consideration to the levels and the types of requirements that they will impose at the selection stage. And that is something which is often considered by SMEs as a particularly burdensome element because they view that contracting authorities often ask unnecessary information or set out unnecessary criteria. And so this new element of making sure that the criteria are appropriate in addition to related and proportionate may focus contracting authorities' minds on the selection criteria. And that theme is developed in particular in relation to the financial and economic standing criteria. At the moment, contracting authorities may establish pass-fail conditions in terms of a financial standing or economic capacity, in terms of minimum turnover, either generally or in relation to the particular types of goods or services or works of the subject matter of the contract. The Commission acknowledges that, but goes further. And as Patrick mentioned, the Commission in the proposal thinks that just working on the basis that the requirements must be proportionate to the contract is too vague, and then it's gone for specifying a precise numerical maximum that can be set, and that is 3 times the value of the contract, unless special risks attached to the nature of the works, supplies or services justify a higher level. So in general circumstances, the threshold for turnover cannot be more than 3 times the value of the contract, but there can be special circumstances justifying a higher level of turnover, and one of the examples mentioned in the non-paper is where the contracting authority has a particularly high need to ensure security of supply, and so they really want to make sure that there is absolutely no risk of failure or default of the contractor, and so in those circumstances they may set the threshold at a higher level than 3 times the value of the contract. Another element that is typically seen as preventing SMEs or discouraging SMEs from participating in public contracts is the amount of information that is required to get through the shortlisting stage. Then there are 2 tools to address this in the proposal. The first one is self-declaration, and the second one is a new brainchild of the Commission called the European Procurement Passport. So there are some doubts as to whether these will really work, but let's see how they would work. So in the future, a contracting authority will still have to assess eligibility and suitability of the candidates, but here the big innovation is that contractors will not have, or candidates will not have to provide all the documentary evidence that they meet the criteria at the PQQ stage. The contracting authority has to take the answers on trust, so they effectively just the candidates will effectively just have to confirm at the PQQ stage that they don't meet any of, or they're not in any of the situations of exclusions, or that they have the relevant experience, etc. Then it's only if that particular bidder is successful that the contracting authority will require the provision of the documentary evidence to support the self-declaration that was made at the beginning of the process. And so instead of having to gather all this documentation as part of the PQQ response, it will only have to be done at the end of the process if the bidder is successful. There is an exception to that, in that the contracting authority may request at any point throughout the procedure the provision of the evidence, and that must then be provided quickly by the candidate. And the idea here is if the contracting authority has some serious doubt at some point during the procedure about the self-declaration and whether the candidate or the bidder in question does meet the criteria, then instead of having to waste its time going through all the procedure with that candidate and wait until the end, then it can request the information earlier. Then there's another small but probably quite helpful provision in there, which says that contracting authorities will not be allowed to request the resubmission of documents when all the evidence has been submitted to the same contracting authority within the past 4 years, and obviously the evidence is still valid. I mean, you could imagine that it expires, but if it is still valid, it has been submitted to the same authority within the last 4 years, then the candidates should not be asked to resubmit that information. Then on this aspect, the last element is the European Procurement Passport. That is a new tool. It's a document that would contain certain basic information about the candidate, and it then must be accepted by contracting authorities as proof of what is in that passport. Seems quite, I mean, it seems a good idea, but probably quite difficult to implement, and I have some real doubts as to whether it will be used in practice. Bidders candidates can request one of these wonderful documents to the competent authority in their member state. Then the European passport will contain a number of elements about the candidate. It will include their name, but most importantly, certification that they have not been convicted of bribery, fraud, money laundering, or terrorism offence. although it doesn't address the question of whether they've paid their taxes and their social security, which is also one of the grounds for exclusion. It will certify that the contractor is not subject to insolvency or winding up proceedings. It will confirm their enrollment in a professional or trade register. It will certify that they possess a particular authorization or that they're a member of a particular organization where membership of that organization is compulsory in order to carry out a particular activity. And then finally, the procurement passport must set out the validity of the passport, which must be no less than 6 months. So assuming that you're lucky enough to get one of these procurement passports, then the good news is that all contracting authorities across the EU will have to accept the passport as proof of fulfillment of the conditions for participation covered by the passport. And these shall not be questioned without justification. So, shall not be questioned without justification means it can be questioned, and one of the cases in which it could be questioned is if the passport was issued more than 6 months ago. So, that probably means that companies, if they really want to make sure that their passport will not be questioned, may have to reapply every 6 months for an update or a new passport, which will in itself involve quite a bit of admin, and so may not be that helpful after all. Now, just a few more indirect ways of helping SMEs. The first, and something which Patrick mentioned earlier, Article 71 allows contracting authorities to pay subcontractors directly. And that does not help SMEs access to public contracts so much, but it does make it more attractive for them to act as subcontractors. So Article 71 says that member states, if they wish, so this is an option for member states, but there's no reason why member states should not implement this provision. So they may provide that at the request of the subcontractor and where the nature of the contract so allows, the contracting authority shall transfer due payment directly to the subcontractor for services, supplies or works provided to the main contractor. So again, this is subject to the condition that member states put in place mechanisms permitting the main contractor to dispute undue payments and that the arrangements for direct payment are also set out in the tender documents. But I can imagine that contracting authorities would be quite willing to do that as a mechanism to increase subcontracting and would probably be quite pressured by SMEs to do that. Probably more the main contractors will not be happy with that proposal. In, again, a similar theme that may indirectly help SMEs is in relation to experience. Patrick mentioned that there are some relaxation of the Lianakis debate in the proposal about or the extent to which one can consider experience at the award stage. And here the proposal introduces a new criterion that is related to the organization, qualifications and experience of the staff assigned to performing the contract. So as Patrick was saying, the bid team. And that in a way could be helpful to SMEs. Contracting authorities will be able to focus their evaluation on the exact people that are going to be performing the contract, and quite often SMEs are strong in that respect because they have one or two individuals, but key individuals that make them quite attractive. And so if a certain focus can now be placed on who exactly will be performing the contract, that may work in SME's favor. One can imagine that a general contractor would more either submit a general team or may wish to subcontract parts and sometimes key parts of the contract to other organizations. So if the focus is now on or can be on the exact people who would be delivering, that may help SMEs. On the other hand, general contractors may adapt and take the necessary resources or skills in-house, and in that case it may not be that helpful. Then under the current rules, there is some confusion as to or the extent to which contracting authorities can restrict the contractor's ability to subcontract performance of the contract or part of the contract, and it's probably the case that under the current rules it cannot do that. Here, Article 62 addresses this point and provides that the contracting authority can require that critical tasks must be performed by the contractor itself. And so again, on the same logic as I was saying before, with consideration of the identity of the bid team, if there is if this provision is used, that the contracting authority can require that critical tasks are performed by the contractor, that may help SMEs with particular skill sets to be to win these contracts. And then finally, a provision that SMEs, but not only SMEs, all bidders will not like, is that Article 55 of the proposal now makes clear that a contractor may be rejected at the shortlisting stage where it has shown significant or persistent deficiencies in the performance of any substantive requirement under a prior contract of a similar nature with the same contracting authority. So here, a poor past performance with the same authority is clearly included as a new ground for exclusion. Again, that is not specifically bad for SMEs, it's bad for all contractors, it's good for contracting authorities, but it will probably be unwelcomed by the bidding community. So, just a few conclusions. Clearly, the new proposals bring some greater clarity on how SMEs will be able to have improved access to public contracts, and at least some of these proposals will really work in that direction. Now, whether in fact this will succeed, we'll have to wait and see how the proposals are implemented in practice. But at least the fact that it is now such a big topic within the Commission itself, and it hasn't always been the case, is good in itself. To focus the minds and draw the attention to this topic more, perhaps, than the detail of how the rules are changed. Thank you.
Very much, Nick.